Aloha mai kako. Mahalo everyone for coming today and being a part of this evening's program. Our first presentation for the Regenerations program series, for the Regenerations exhibit that's happening here at Bishop Museum. And tonight, I want to introduce our President and CEO, Melanie Ide, and she will be giving you a little bit of information about our speakers and opening us up this evening. Mahalo, Melanie.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to welcome everybody. I see Keolu clapping. We're all very happy to have launched this series this evening. This, as Kelly said, is the first in a series of programs for our recently opened exhibition, Regenerations, which is Regenerations Challenging Scientific Racism in Hawaii. So we're very pleased to have this chance to have Jillian and Keolu do the presentation this evening that really introduces the program and the exhibition. And just a little bit about each of them. Jillian Swift, one of the 3 curators of the program, is our curator of archaeology at Bishop Museum. She's also an affiliate, associate, graduate, faculty member. Is that right, Jillian? So it's an affiliate faculty member at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And that's also in conjunction with the Department of Anthropology there. So Jillian's work really focuses on zooarchaeology, and that's the study of faunal remains. She can probably go into much more detail there, but what she's looking at is the long-term interactions between humans and the environment, looking at how environmental management practices of the past can help us understand sustainability concerns today. So that work is extremely exciting, and I know she's doing active research now in conjunction with UH. Keolu Fox is joining us from San Diego, and he's an assistant professor at UC San Diego, and is also affiliated with the Department of Anthropology there, as well as the Global Health Program, the Climate Action Lab, and the Indigenous Futures Lab. So Keolu's work focuses on questions of functionalizing genomics, and I'm going to leave it to the audience to ask him all those questions about what that means. I'm going to turn it over to both of them, and also I hope Jillian will be able to introduce Leah, who's kind of behind the scenes with us this evening as well, our 3rd curator. So Jillian and Keolu, please take it away and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you everybody who has joined us live here today. This is the start of our Regenerations programming series. Because it is the first talk, the first thing I really wanted to do was provide just a brief introduction to the exhibit itself. I'm going to try and be brief if possible so that I can give Keolu plenty of time to expand on some of the themes that we have in our exhibit, and our future talks will do the same. So to give a little bit of an introduction to the exhibit, it was curated by the 3 of us. You'll hear from Keolu and I today, but Leah Caldera, our 3rd curator and the director of library and archives here at the museum, is also here in chat. And so she will be moderating questions and comments. So if you have any questions throughout the exhibit, throughout the presentation, you can feel free to pop them into chat, and she'll be there to address them and figure out which ones we should be talking about live after the presentation. And I do, before moving on, want to put in a little plug for our next talk, which will be Thursday, April 15th, same time, same place. This will be by Elima Long, who is giving a presentation on the introduction of eugenics, and specifically eugenics curriculum into Hawaii. Elima's master's thesis was very influential to us while we were creating this exhibit. There was just so much we wanted to talk about in this exhibit that we really only had time to touch on this very briefly. And so I'm really excited to host her next month, and she'll be able to expand on this and the impacts of eugenics in Hawaii in the early 1900s. So to give a little bit of background about the Sullivan Collection, what this is a collection of photographs and plaster busts that live here in the museum that were collected in 1920 and 1921 by an anthropologist by the name of Louis Sullivan. So the idea to do an exhibit on the Sullivan collections was actually in existence before I even got to the museum. I've been here for about 2 years now, so that gives you a sense of how long the exhibits process is actually in development. And I was invited by Leah to co-curate, and then the more we started talking about our ideas, we realized it would be really great to bring Keolu on as well, who will be able to connect these historical themes that I'm going to talk about to issues in present day. So the Sullivan Collection is this collection of photography, plaster busts of people of Hawaiian descent living in Hawaii in 1920. Sullivan traveled to all of the islands in Hawaii except for Ni'ihau and took these photographs. And today, these photographs have become one of the museum's primary sources for genealogical research. I'm actually not going to show much of the Sullivan Collection until the end of my talk, but so that you're not completely ungrounded in what the Sullivan Collection is, I just thought I'd throw up this banner that you may have seen already. This is Lamaka Ho'olapo from the Sullivan Collection, and then a contemporary photograph of his great-great-granddaughter, Anne-Marie Paikai. We worked with Anne-Marie on this exhibit along with several other collaborators, and she was kind enough to volunteer to serve as our public face of our exhibit. And so you may have seen her in advertising materials already. I'm also coming to you from the exhibit itself. So if you can see the background behind me at all still, the photographs in the background are also photographs from the Sullivan Collection and in fact of Anne-Marie's family. And so we've had this collection since the 1920s, and my understanding is that it really didn't become this genealogical resource until the late 1980s, 1990s. And at this point, people working in the collections here at the museum recognized that we had this really incredible photographic resource and started sharing it with the public. And in fact, I think they even took all of the photographs around to all of the different islands so that they could introduce these photographs back to everyone in Hawaii, start making connections, just creating awareness that this collection exists in our museum. And I think the more that people were able to see it and interact with it, it increasingly kind of became this new, it had this new purpose, right, as a genealogical resource. And that's a really cool story and a really great one for our museum to tell. But there is another side to this collection, and that is the other half of this story, which is the challenging scientific racism in Hawaii. So you might be asking yourself why somebody would travel around the Hawaiian Islands in the 1920s taking photographs. Photography was very rare, so it was a pretty impressive thing to do, and that's why our collection is so important, is because it's often one of the few or one of the only photographs of the people these people living in the 1920s. The reason they exist, however, has its origins in a scientific enterprise that has now really been discredited and has left a legacy being embedded in a sort of racist scientific practice that is no longer conducted, but has left an impression. So Sullivan was invited to the museum in 1920, and he was invited to be a research affiliate at the museum. His post was actually as a researcher at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He was working under the director, Henry Fairfield Osborne, who I am probably going to talk about a little bit more in a moment. He was invited to Hawaii to take part in the Bayard-Dominic expeditions. I think you could do an entire lecture on the Bayard-Dominic expeditions as well. In some ways, they were very ahead of their time, and in many, many others, they were very much a product of their time. So the Dominic expeditions was a large-scale, multifaceted anthropology research initiative led by the Bishop Museum, and its goal was to solve the problem of Polynesian origins. This work led to a lot of really foundational anthropological work, but the work is, of course, embedded in this, the idea that there is a problem to be solved in Polynesian origins. And so I put this news clipping here in this slide just to give you kind of an idea of how far-ranging and really ultimately absurd the ideas of where Polynesian peoples might have come from. And this itself has a grounding in some racially motivated ideas. This idea that Polynesian peoples couldn't have possibly come from Asia, it's possible that they traveled from, well, all over the place, clearly. So in order to kind of address this in the 1920s, this expedition was mounted in multiple islands across Polynesia. And one of them, of course, was Hawaii. So there was a team of anthropologists that were sent to study this problem of Polynesian origins in Hawaii. Kenneth Emery was the archaeologist who was sent, and Lewis Sullivan was the physical anthropologist. And so the kind of work that Sullivan was doing as the physical anthropologist for these Dominic expeditions, and he really coordinated this research for the entire expedition, in fact, was this idea of taking physical measurements of people. He created these photographs and he created these busts in order to facilitate taking very precise, what he felt at the time were objective scientific measurements of facial features, of physical characteristics. And what he intended to do with these measurements was to use them to create a category and a set of physical parameters and characteristics that would make up a supposedly pure Hawaiian race. Okay, so we know now that this kind of work is entirely discredited. Race has no biological foundation whatsoever. But the work that Sullivan did, Sullivan and his contemporaries, really served to solidify these ideas of race and that racial categories exist. Of course, these ideas continue today and continue to have very profound social, economic, political consequences. And so knowing that about the origins of this collection, we really had a challenge ahead of us, because the story we really want to tell is this one of regeneration, of this collection taking on a new life and having a new purpose, and a sort of reclaiming of these photographs. But we really felt that it was important that we be honest and forthright about the origins of this collection, and that we not shy away from our own responsibilities in creating this collection. We also thought it was a really good opportunity to educate on the idea of race, to reiterate the idea that race is really not a biological or scientific reality, that this is a socially constructed reality. That in fact it is a reality that was invented through and by and for colonialism, and that because of this, it continues to have very real and very profound impacts. So I am going to talk a little bit about this history. We have included a table in the exhibit. I'm going to show a few images of some of the things that we've included in the table. The idea is to trace back to the very origins of the concept of race itself, and to show how this developed, how it was employed, and how it kind of emerged and was forgotten, but not entirely forgotten, and really continues to be with us today, despite decades of understanding that there is no scientific basis to race. So we're starting here with early naturalist explorers in Europe. Now, of course, before this, people talk about physical differences. People have always recognized physical differences, but this isn't really the same as what happens in the early 1700s, this time of naturalist explorers traveling around, recognizing all of these different groups of people. And we have naturalists that are identifying, describing, categorizing different species. And then they're starting to think about whether or not this can be done for humans as well. There are early thoughts that maybe we're different species. That kind of goes away for the most part, and then there's more discussion of, well, maybe we're subspecies, and eventually it settles into this idea of different races. But this is still not anything really scientific. It doesn't take off in the scientific mainstream. It just starts to be bubbling up in the popular consciousness. And what happens later on in this, something I do want to point out is that I'm talking about these categories and they might seem very benign, but really from the get-go they are not, because the people creating the categories are largely these European explorers. They are white, wealthy, European men, and they hold themselves as the standard for what it means to be human. And so very early on in creating these different categories, they uphold themselves as the standard and create hierarchies where the further away you get from the person creating these categories, the worse you are. So there's already a lot of bias even in this original idea of what if we can categorize different people. In the 1800s, phrenology comes in. And so that's what we're showing here. On the left is a photo of actually our exhibit table. So it's showing a phrenology bust in the foreground. And this really was basically like palm reading, but with heads. The idea was that the different shape and size of various parts of the human head corresponded to different personality traits. And then this idea gets taken on into the racial discussion with the idea that all different races have these physical characteristics, which we can categorize, and then that they would then mean something about inherent traits. So if you can look at if you can see the words on these images, things like language aptitude, appetite, belligerence, all of these kinds of ideas start getting connected into these constructs that are being created and called racial categories. It's all totally made up, and even at the time, it was not a science. It was never a science, it was pseudoscience, but it gets taken on into the popular consciousness because, as you can imagine, it is quite appealing for certain parties. And so I put these two images in juxtaposition with each other. The one on the left is called a cephalometer. So this is a reproduction actually of the cephalometer that was used by the phrenologist that sailed with Dumont d'Urville across the Pacific. And so this phrenologist, even at this time in this early phase, was taking measurements, creating plaster busts, and had this device to create these categorizations. Those plaster busts that were collected across the Pacific are now in Paris. They're now at the Musée de l'Homme, as well as the real version of this cephalometer. I have put the second picture next to it. If you've seen Django Unchained, Leonardo DiCaprio's character plays someone who is actually modeled off of a real slaveholding individual. His name was Charles Caldwell. People like Caldwell, and there are many examples of this, take on these ideas of phrenology because it is a really convenient way to create a fiction where certain types of people can be justified as suited to slavery. And that is what Caldwell did. And he in fact traveled to Paris to meet with the phrenologist who sailed across the Pacific and created these busts. He studied these busts in order to build that theory. So I wanted to put this in here just to show how global how pervasive, how interconnected these ideas and these kinds of social machinations are, and how they're all connecting together. This is how things are up until the late 1800s. And what happens at this point is anthropology steps in. And anthropology at this time sort of considers itself the study of race, because this is the sort of ongoing philosophy as anthropology is emerging. And so this is here where we can situate Sullivan and Sullivan's work along this temporal spectrum. Sullivan was operating in the 1920s, which is really at the tail end of these ideas. But what Sullivan did was to take all of these ideas that were so far in the pseudoscience realm, that were all speculative, that were all just kind of popularly tossed about, and they legitimized this into a scientific enterprise. They developed tools and metrics that they could use to create objective measurements of people's physical characteristics, and use these to start to create boxes of what would be so-called pure races. And that was the kind of work that Sullivan was engaged in while he was here in Hawaii. So in conjunction with this, it's really important to recognize that at this time, Sullivan's time, this early 1900s period, eugenics was very, very popular. It was especially popular in the US, and it was especially popular with Sullivan's boss at AMNH, Henry Osborne, who presided over the Second International Congress on Eugenics in 1921. And this was held at the American Museum of Natural History. And in conjunction with this Congress, there was an exhibition. I know the photo on the right is very blurry, but that is a picture of the exhibition that was going on. Sullivan took this collection to New York, and it was on display in this exhibit. And this is really the only time that this collection is shared with the public or talked about. Because Sullivan actually ends up, he dies at a very young age in 1925, before he actually was able to finish all of his work. So what we have is that he has taken this to this Congress. I don't actually even know how long the Congress was. Our Sullivan file is pretty scant. But at some point, the collection does make its way back to us, and ends up housed in libraries and archives and in the ethnology department, where it is today and where it remained for a long time until these activities in the 1980s kind of start to transform them into a new source. You know, it's really not until the 1960s that these ideas get overturned. And the reason for that is the popularity of eugenics actually spreads from America over to Germany. And Germany takes on these tools enthusiastically and develops tools of their own, continues to further this idea of race science. And these tools are used to enable the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero and the Nama people in what is now Namibia. And they are also used to ultimately facilitate the atrocities of the Holocaust. So it is really building up to this ultimate point and the end of World War II and the formation of UNESCO, that these methods, eugenics, anthropometry, race, racism, race science, all of these are very aggressively condemned at the end of World War II by UNESCO with their statements against race and racism, and by the general public. This whole idea falls out of favor. But of course we know it really doesn't disappear because these conversations are still happening. Everything I've told you about, we have known for decades about this science, and yet these scientific methods are still used to justify a number of social inequalities. So I also put on an excerpt from the 2019 AAPA statement on race and racism, because physical anthropology is still a discipline today, but they are also in the process of doing this kind of reflective work and transforming their own discipline. And the whole thing is worth reading if you're interested in this topic. It is a very eloquent description and condemnation of this scientific practice. So I'm going to leave us on this quote, which when I was fact checking a few things for the exhibit, I came across this quote in Louis Sullivan's obituary, and I thought it was quite fitting for where I'm going to move into next, which is this regeneration, talking about this transformation of the collection, because I don't think even the person writing the obituary at the time would have guessed about the ultimate purpose of this collection, which has now become much more powerful and meaningful and significant than the product of any research that would have been published in the 1920s. And so we are here understanding this history, knowing that we want to share this, and also confronted with, of these 900 plus photographs, how do we find a way to show them? How do we find a way to show them recontextualized away from their role as scientific subjects? How do we rehumanize these photographs and tell this story of a new way of looking at this collection? And the way we decided to do it was by collaborating with people who have ancestors and relatives in the Sullivan Collection. And so what we ended up doing was reaching out to people who had accessed the Sullivan Collection before, telling them a little bit about what we were thinking about for an exhibit, and asking if they would be willing to collaborate with us. And these 5 families, represented by the folks you see on the screen here, got back to us and have been really, really generous. They have shared so much of their time, so many incredible stories, even some of their family heirlooms with us to be able to put this exhibit together. And so I do, before I hand over to Keolu, I do want to spend just a moment with each of these families. Not too in depth, because really what I'm going to show you is their stories, and I hope that you can come to the exhibit and see them for yourself, because you should really hear it from them. But just a few moments of showing these photographs and the kind of unique stories that have developed out of them. The first family is the Ho'olapa family, who I have shown you once already, this same image. And our collaborator was Anne-Marie Paikai. And what I wanted to share about the Ho'olapas is that we were really fortunate early on to have received this page from a scrapbook that was made for a part of their family. And you can see that it features 2 of these Sullivan photographs, recontextualized in this really beautiful, loving way. We were lucky that this was shared with us early on. It was a huge inspiration. We realized that what we wanted to do was to create something similar, to honor these people, to honor their lives and their memories, and to do so in a way that is as far away from the Sullivan Collection as it can be, in our own museum version of what a family scrapbook could look like. So this was a big inspiration. You might even be able to see it behind me right now because it's included in the exhibit. Our second family, the Akona, also known as Hamauku family. This is Lucy Kaluna Akona. She is the great-great-grandmother of Charnel and Marlea Renti Cruz, who we collaborated with. I'm showing this because this kind of shows the kind of information that we added to each of these photographs for this, to recontextualize. So folks in library and archives did their own archival research alongside collaborating with the descendants to get their own stories, to fact check, to make sure that their histories and our histories could come together. And we ended up with a short biography of each individual that we put next to all of the photographs that we show. I also wanted to show Charnel and Marlea. One of the things that came up a lot in conversation with people who had accessed the Sullivan Collection was this idea of recognition, of seeing these photographs for the first time and recognizing your family, meeting them, forming this recognition and connection that really is indescribable. So I won't keep trying to describe it, but it is one of the most powerful things that have come through in the interviews that we have in the exhibit. And especially the family resemblance. I've heard so many comments, especially with Charnel and Marlea, how much they look like their great-great-grandmother. So I wanted to put them side by side here. This is the Aokai family. We worked with Noah Dolim on this. And a couple interesting things here. This is a photograph of the exhibit. And so this is just kind of a way to show you how we've arranged things in the exhibit itself. We have the photographs with rails below that provide biographical information. We also put them next to a photograph, a contemporary photograph of our descendant collaborator next to their family members. And then an interview is on the iPad below the photograph. And that's about a 5 to 7 minute clip of interviews of them talking about their family, talking about their experiences with the Sullivan Collection. And these have been really powerful. Noah is one of the few who also have other pictures of these family members. So these are the same two brothers, but in a different context outside of the Sullivan photographs. And it's really cool to see this kind of side by side and see how different the photographs are, see how different the mood is, how different the feeling is to look at these different photographs. The Duvet family, apologies for, I had a hard time taking a picture of the Duvet family. There's a lot of them. And so fortunately, I know Keolu has a better picture coming, but I just wanted to show everyone the family photo on the left and the Duvet family lined up here. I struggle with what to say about the Duvet family because the most powerful things for me really came from Nolani's interviews. And so I hope that if you do see the exhibit, you will come and listen to Nolani. The Duvets have a very storied history. They're in the news a lot. They've done some very heroic things. They have, one story that we talked about a lot is that 3 of the members of the family were arrested for murder and actually later pardoned for that murder. And we were able to have this interview and be able to provide a space for Nolani to tell that story in her own words. And when you hear the story, it is a very rich and complicated and fascinating tale. And there is much more to it than the newspapers would have you believe. So it was very exciting to have that there. The final family, and I know I'm going over time, so I'm going to be very quick here. The final family is the Ohana Wentworth family. The people in the photograph are the parents, Havila and Alice, and some of their children, but they actually had 15 children. 4 of those children passed away very early, but the other 11 went on to have large families of their own. There are now over 4,000 Kaleohanos and Wentworths. I worked with just one, Dean Kayave, but he was representing a large number of his family members. And you know, one of the very first things that we talked about was, why are some of the children missing? And how important it was to them. You know, they wanted to participate in this exhibit, they wanted to be in it, but it was really important to have all the family members present. And so after a lot of conversation about this, what we were able to do is actually show their family plaques. So what you can see here are 13 plaques. The top is Havila and Alice. The picture on the left is the picture from the Sullivan Collection. And these are all the children, and the colors represent each family from each one of these ancestors. And these plaques come together at the large Kaleohano Wentworth family reunions and are celebrated. And each family wears colors, t-shirts in the color of their family. And to me, this is such a emblematic example of how the Sullivan Collection has taken on this new life once it is outside our museum walls, once it is interacting with our community members, that I just really love that. And then the last thing I want to mention is, because I haven't talked about the busts, and so I'm ending us in a sort of ambiguous space. We were not able to collaborate in the same way with descendants of the plaster busts. These plaster busts were made by Sullivan of Kamehameha School's students during a time when the museum and KS shared a campus. And so we have 44 of these busts of Kamehameha School students. We went ahead and did our own archival research to be able to recontextualize these as well, to be able to provide stories about their histories. But when we reached out, we were unable to make contact with any of their descendants. The 3 we chose to show are 3 that are connected to people that we know who have come in and have visited the collection and were able to spend time with their family members. We just weren't able to make contact with them again. So it was a challenging decision whether we would show these busts, and ultimately we decided that we wanted to show these 3, if only to make sure that people are aware that these are in our collections, and hopefully to build and rebuild these connections with these busts and their descendants. That's actually where I'm going to leave us, because I'd like to hand it over to Keolu, who is going to talk about the aspects of this exhibit I have not touched on yet, and to even take these further into the future. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing and hand things over.
Good. All right. First, I'd like to just say that it's been a true pleasure getting to work with our Lahui, our community, and many of the amazing partners and partnerships that we've had throughout this process. I've been coming to this museum since I was a little keiki, you know, so it's a true honor to have the opportunity to work on something that's so relevant and so empowering for our community. And I want to tell you a little bit about the behind the scenes and how we developed some of the content for this, and then connect it to my own work and many, many, many other things that are going on in the space of anthropology and health, and what it looks like when Indigenous people and Kanaka Maoli really utilize these new and emerging tools to think about and prioritize our questions. So first of all, this is a photo that we took on the opening day, and you can see this beautiful Anui Nui, and I have totally enjoyed working with my co-curators and everybody on this project. Amazing time, auspicious omen, you know, great time. I know there's rainbows every day in Hawaii, but still looks good. One of the main themes for us was reckoning with history and thinking about the many different ways in which, you know, different scientists had upheld this idea about eugenics and scientific racism and measurement theory and many of these different ideas. And a lot of it actually started at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where they would have annual meetings for eugenic research. And here's a photo of one of those meetings in 1918. Now, for me, I did my own learning and thought about this later, because I actually went to school also at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and I took an advanced genome sequences and technologies and applications class. And here's me in 2014 there with Nobel laureate James Watson, who's a highly complicated figure in the field of many of these new tools like genome sequencing and sort of decoding the double helix. As you can see here, these books that he's published on the paper. But I don't think Cold Spring Harbor knew that arming Kanaka Maoli with these new tools, I don't think they knew what they were going to get. I don't think that was anticipated, that we would think about using these tools in totally novel ways, to think about empowering our community, to think about creating literacy and enabling us to just really think about how do we use these tools to move forward and reappropriate a lot of this history, right, and reckon with it in these novel ways. Throughout this exhibit, we spent a lot of time thinking about the anthropology of the past, and Jillian did such an excellent job explaining many of the different tools and ideas and perspectives, you know, from phrenology to understanding hair color to eye color. One of the creepiest things in this whole exhibit is this box where they have all of these different eyes. I totally recommend checking it out. And then anthropometry itself, and this is an image from the cover of Maile Arvin's book, who I believe will be giving one of the other lectures. Highly recommend checking that out. And then contrasting this idea of the anthropology of the past with the anthropology of the present and the acceleration and the emergence of something called genome sequencing technology, understanding human genetics, population genetics, comparing different populations of people at the genetic code level, and this new field and the acceleration of something called paleogenetics, not paleogenetics, and which is ancient genomics, and literally deriving genome data and genetic material from iwi kupuna and partially destroying the remains, extracting DNA and sequencing it. And some of the themes you'll find throughout this exhibit are that this type of technology is becoming cheaper, more accurate, and more reproducible, meaning it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. There's more and more data generated all of the time. A really hard kind of pill to swallow is to think about this. Is ancient DNA research revealing new truths about our human migratory history, our diaspora? Can we connect it to our susceptibility to disease, or are we kind of falling into old traps? Are we recapitulating and revisiting the same ideas that someone like Sullivan, for example, had been thinking about? Are we using new and emerging scientific tools to double down on the same issues around race and eugenics, right? Making matters quite complex is this true acceleration. And here's a paper that myself and paleoanthropologist John Hawks published in the journal Nature, where we show and highlight that there's a bone rush going on. More ancient genomes have been sequenced in 2019 than the entirety of history. So there's this renewed interest, and there's a lack of engagement of the communities of people that represent those iwi kupuna or ancient remains of those communities. It's kind of like the wild west with these new tools. In fact, there have been many new ancient genomics labs that have been constructed since 2010. And here's a piece I published in the SAA record showing that on this geographical map. Each of those pins in red is a new ancient genomics laboratory that has sort of sprung up since 2010. And you can see they're all over the world, and they require ancient DNA and remains to be processed to stay in business. But look no further than Christie's, Sotheby's, eBay, Instagram as thriving markets where ancient remains of indigenous people are sold to the highest bidder online or in auction houses around the world. And we wanted to bring attention to many of those issues through this exhibit, just to say, we need to create a accountability around these issues. We need to involve community members as stakeholders in the way that we think about repatriating the past and empowering and putting a new attention and focus on our mo'oku'auhau, or our genealogy. And selling our ancestors' remains online is hewa, it's criminal. It's not something that should happen. And so this is an educational process for many of the people that are going to come and visit this exhibit. We feature many of these ideas, and our ancestors, they're not just artifacts. When we look at lei made of human hair or earrings made of human hair, these are our ancestors. They also contain DNA. This could be used to further disenfranchise indigenous peoples, or it could be used to empower us. But we need to center our ancestors and our priorities in a way that allows us to have a frank conversation about this, so we can come to consensus and connectivity around many of these ideas. And that's just what you see here throughout the exhibit. We were also inspired by something that's pretty interesting, and that is the commodification of DNA that is derived from contemporary genomes. So when you contribute your genome to 23andMe, I'd like to inform you that they're selling access to their database to GlaxoSmithKline, who is then going to use that data to develop the next generation of pharmaceutical drugs. So in 2018, they sold access to GSK for $300 million. Many of you may not know that. In addition to that number and that value of DNA, your mo'oku'auhau, your relationship to your ancestors, is on the rise, moving from $300 million in 2018 to 4.7, as Ancestry.com is sold to the major real estate group Blackstone in 2020 for $4.7 billion. We play with that theme throughout this exhibit. We have some really talented and incredible people working on this. This company is not real, for the record, but it is a lot of fun to think about. And we called it the Biocolonial Trust, or the Biocolonialism Trust. And we have many of these themes and ideas and products that are modeled after many of the direct-to-consumer products that actually exist, that people are participating in and not understanding what the unintended consequences are of allowing your DNA to go to a company that's going to commodify it. We also play with themes around thinking about an entire genome in your backpack. Again, these tools are so ubiquitous, you can bring them anywhere in the world. The possibility of things that you can do with that are remarkable. Think about them in the context of global health or humanitarian aid, or things like this for point of care genomics research, but also they can be used to collect and extract various types of genomic information from bacteria and flora and fauna and human beings. We also explore the idea of consent, and we think about what that means and how consent has evolved over time and how blanket language is used to coerce people into participating in these sorts of studies. We want to use this as an opportunity to educate the public. We explore the idea of genome editing and CRISPR babies throughout this with this very interesting tool where we discuss the potential looming sort of brave new world of health disparities that might exist in a country where almost 40 to 60 million people don't have access to healthcare coverage. We need to forecast and think about ways where, listen, if you don't have healthcare coverage, you're definitely not getting a designer baby, and what are the consequences of that? So these themes are sort of throughout our exhibit. But I think the most important and powerful thing that has come out of this is the way that we have co-designed and centered the Hawaiian people throughout this exhibit. And this is this amazing photo of one of our friends and family members, Nalani, with her new baby, literally looking at a picture of herself and her baby. And to me, it's very special because this is the educational opportunity we're talking about for the next generation of Indigenous scientists and innovators, and exposing our youth to what's coming in the future and forecasting that is so very important. And I think we've kind of hit on this a number of different times in a number of different ways, but none of this is possible without the participation of the Kanaka Maoli community. Finally, this is centered and is a part of a much, much larger decolonial museum movement. Here we have Benin bronzes at the British Museum that are slated to be repatriated, many of them. And it's really important to think about what the Bishop Museum is doing and how progressive this exhibit is, and in context of owning its history and reflecting on its history and reckoning with its own history. Finally, I wanted to think about and prioritize how important it is that we're looking through these contexts and these artifacts and these archives through an Indigenous lens and looking for opportunities to empower our community. Recently, when I was at the museum, somebody from our community came up to me and said, "Hey, Keolu, why did you guys make this? Like, why would somebody from Kansas or Wisconsin want to come here and see this?" And I said, "Uncle, it's not for them. It's for you. It's for you. It's for your family. It's for our families and our opportunities. It's for us to repatriate our history and our identity by centering and looking through this through an Indigenous lens. So just a few more concepts for today. That was a little background on the museum exhibit itself, but now I want to kind of dig into some other really important ideas. One of them is everybody's using the word diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, but who's actually executing on this, and what does this mean, and how do we ensure that it reaches its full potential? Secondly, back to this idea about a lens, how do you make sure you're using the right lens for the right project? I think that we, through the development of this exhibit, have achieved that because we've iteratively gone back and forth with our community members to make a better product. And I want to explain how that works and how that can be applied to other projects, especially in the context of health and medicine. And then finally, one of my favorite Olelo Noyau or Native Hawaiian proverbs is Kava Mamua, Kava Mahope, walking backwards into the future, recognizing the mistakes that you've made in the past and not repeating them. Or as our brothers and sisters in Turtle Island say, thinking 10 generations into the future or 10 generations into the past, how do we utilize those concepts in the content we create, whether you're a scientist or an artist? And I want to dig a little bit into that. Okay, first, this one. I spent a lot of time working at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda as a genome scientist working for the Human Genome Research Project. And there I worked on these really specific projects called genome-wide association studies, where we would compare different populations of people. We mostly focused on diseases that are related to neglected tropical disease, like this one called podoconiosis or mossy foot syndrome. It was a very interesting time to learn about population genetics. It taught me a number of things in terms of how we understand the inheritance of disease and the role that genetics may play in understanding and predicting and preventing disease. Throughout that project, though, I learned that this was probably in 2010, we started to think about sequencing more and more people's genomes in order to compare them and understand the differences in a way that would have an impact for health. Through this, we started something as a government initiative in America called the 1,000 Genomes Project. Now, what I came to understand throughout the development of this project is that some populations were being included and some populations were being excluded. That means that as we chart the future of medicine, we were prioritizing certain populations over others. What we realized throughout the development of many of these projects is that the vast majority of human genomes that were being sequenced to understand the heritability of disease and kind of chart the path of something called precision medicine were individuals that come from Western European ancestry. Meaning, as we develop these new tools, we're not including the populations of people who are suffering from some very severe health disparities. Yet we're all paying for this with our hard-earned taxpayers' dollars. There are reasons for this. One of them is because of things like eugenics, because many different historically marginalized populations of people do not trust science or research. However, if we involve Indigenous communities in this process, in the decision-making process, throughout the development of larger projects, you can get to a point where you can integrate many of those ideas and perspectives to create better projects that actually have an impact in health. And I'm going to explain a few of those projects and ideas. One thing, though, that happened was something called the Havasupai Case. And I wanted to take this as a moment to just educate everyone on why there is this stigma against genetic research and why the Navajo Nation currently has a moratorium on genetic research. And the reason is because investigators from a specific university in the state of Arizona reached out to the Havasupai Nation and said, listen, we know you have problems with type 2 diabetes. We want to basically work with you to understand if it's an inherited disorder. We'll use your genetic information to determine why you have this specific metabolic disease, not really understanding or looking into some of the issues that are related to colonialism and access to land and health and nutrition. These investigators then turned around and used that exact same information to do something they didn't have consent for. They studied and prioritized projects that had to do with schizophrenia, and many other things. This culminated in a lawsuit with the Havasupai settling out of court and suing Arizona State University. But the far greater issue here is that this caused a domino effect, a ripple effect throughout indigenous communities around the world. This solidified this stigma against biomedical research because this consent was broken. Many of these ancestors' blood samples were repatriated to the community, but it left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. And it's highly problematic to this day. However, we're working forward and thinking about new ways to involve and educate the next generation of indigenous genome scientists. So here we have a paper that myself and a number of indigenous genome scientists, my brothers and sisters, published in the journal Nature Communications. And enhancing ethical genomic research with indigenous communities starts with sovereignty and research regulation. We focus on respect, equity, reciprocity, beneficence, cultural competency, capacity building, and transparency. We talked about the ubiquity of many of these point of care tools, but what does it look like when those tools are in the hands of indigenous people? What types of questions would we prioritize? How would we integrate them into our already existing knowledge systems? Here we have a sensor that can be directly implemented into a surfboard, for example, to pick up pH or temperature data. It might be useful for thinking about climate change and the climate crisis. We have a remote ultrasound that connects directly to your iPhone, which can be used for anything from neonatal care to animal husbandry. And we have a mobile genome sequencer that connects directly to the iPhone, which could be used in a whole bunch of different directions. It's all about who uses the technology and how it's prioritized. We also have to recognize that once that data is created, it is now the #1 resource on planet Earth, surpassing oil in 2018. So this new and nascent field of indigenous data sovereignty and thinking about the fact that indigenous people deserve ownership of their data, what happens to it, how it's accessed, what's the security, and how it's ultimately commodified is a new and emerging idea to a lot of people. Whereas in the case of indigenous people, it's like, no, we've been thinking about this for some time, but something to think about. And we put out this review in Nature Genetics with a number of colleagues from Aotearoa. There is no substitute for democratizing technology. This is one of my good friends, Hayden Henry. He is from Tauranga in Aotearoa, and this is his first time doing a PCR. I love this photo because it shows that even with that extra large lab coat, it doesn't fit this giant Maori man. And that kind of represents what's going on in science. We have this one size fits all way of thinking about genetics when we really need to think about accommodating multiple perspectives and ideas and prioritizing different hypotheses and questions that come from those communities. Okay, so in summary, from design to decision-making, involve indigenous communities and their perspectives. We've done that with regenerations. We'll continue to do that. We hope the Bishop Museum continues to do that. Understanding history is really important, reckoning with history, and how can you use these technologies to make indigenous peoples partners and not subjects? And overall, how do we empower this indigenous perspective? So that brings us to, how do you know if you're using the right lens for the right project? And I love this photo because this man is clearly taking a photo of something, but you know, he's from a totally different culture in the Amazon, and who knows what he's prioritizing in his art. I'm sure it's beautiful, but it embodies many of the ideas that we're thinking about. Our next story brings us to the University of Otago in the South Island of Aotearoa, or Dunedin. And there is a family that by the name of the McLeods, and they reached out to a university because they had really high rates of gastric cancer. I want to contrast this with what happened with the Havasupai. And they said, we think it's inherited. We'd like to participate in a study. We believe that we might have a genetic mutation. They had done their own mo'oku auhau in genealogy to understand the potential heritable effect and what they think was going on. They worked closely with investigators in the medical school there in a true partnership. And they published this paper in the journal Nature. They identified a brand new gene that can be used to predict and prevent gastric cancer in populations all over the world. And one of the things that was the coolest, and I call this the let the people come to you model, is that in 1998, they included 4 people from the family in the author list in the paper that was published in Nature. They created currency for the community members on the scientific level. This was a win-win situation. We love going to Aotearoa because I like to dive. I like to see my brothers and sisters over there. We don't just fish, we catch fish, as you can see. But there's no substitute for grassroots research and bringing people together to come to consensus and connectivity around ideas. Here you can see that us coming together and having a oceanic metabolic disease conference in Ahipara in the northernmost tip of Aotearoa, where we're thinking about and prioritizing different types of metabolic disease research related to health, and doing that in a grassroots way. Many of these people had never slept in a marae. A lot of them have, and it was a very interesting experience for a lot of people because we got to share our culture and the way we think about science and health. My partners over there are also finding all kinds of interesting ways to work with different types of people, including the Moko Foundation, who is working on a metabolic disease genomics study with local rugby teams, of many of which are Maori. So in summary, wrapping this one up, recognize that you might not have the right lens, be willing to use the right lens when it comes along, the let the people come to you model, and be willing to allow it to kind of come from outside. All right, finally, kawa mamua, kawa mahope. This last story brings us to the piko of Hawaiian culture, the summit of Mauna Kea on the Big Island. Recently, I and many other people have been thinking about this idea of how far in the future should we be looking with the development of a brand new telescope that has polarized the Native Hawaiian community and made it the epicenter of Indigenous rights on planet Earth in many different ways. This 30-meter telescope with a lens the size of a basketball court has, on the one hand, the potential to look so far into the universe that we might understand the origins of the Big Bang itself. However, as we recognize that this would be an engineering marvel by looking farther into the space and have these new insights into cosmology, we also need to ask another question. Why not look directly in front of your face and think about what the consequences of building something like this might be in terms of conservation, how it affects our access to fresh water, the fact that Hawaii is already the invasive species capital of the world and the endangered species capital of the world. This also brings up another bunch of issues around burial remains and protecting our iwi kupuna and letting our ancestors rest at peace. And so you see this juxtaposition. But this conflict was never about culture versus science. It really never had to do anything with that because our ancestors, our kupuna, have been some of the greatest scientists in history, utilizing ecological metadata and the celestial sphere itself to find some of the most remote places on planet Earth. When you talk about who's the best voyaging people in the world, it's not really a question. And the real question is that the fight for something like Mauna Kea is about a fight against colonial science itself. It's against things like eugenics. It's not culture versus science. And we can think about new ways in which we use genomic technologies to reframe another question, which is how far in the past should we be looking? How many generations in the past? And one of those is, if we think about 1778, when Cook arrives in Hawaii itself, and we forecast and we look at that and we do the mathematics of that and we say, okay, each generation is 20 years. That's about 12 generations ago. What is the impact of that on the human genome of indigenous peoples? We know that since the arrival of Captain Cook and many other Europeans, we have had the introduction of many different diseases like Maipake or Hansen's disease, and this has caused a sharp decline in the Hawaiian population, shaping the genomes of contemporary Hawaiian people. This idea is quite ubiquitous, from Cook to Cortez, if you will. The introduction of things like syphilis, Maipake, and many other pathogens, which we're currently experiencing through this pandemic, have shaped the genomes of indigenous people. This is a very interesting idea. Jared Diamond likes to say that it's guns, germs, and steel, which have privileged the European perspective, but it's really more like germs, germs, and germs. If you think about a population reduction in size of 80%, this shapes gene regions like HLA, or the human leukocyte antigen, where we have these population bottleneck events, and you have a surviving population of people. This shapes our genomes, these pathogens. Over time, nothing has been more profound in shaping our genomes and reducing something like HLA diversity, for example. New insights into understanding the diversity of our genomes can help us understand susceptibility to things like COVID-19. Many of the things we're seeing, and I'm not saying that genomics is the only variable, there are many different variables that contribute to why we have certain types of disease susceptibility, but that's why, for example, a lot of the epidemiological data is showing that Pacific Islanders are really being hit hard by something like the coronavirus. By having new techniques and ideas and ways to compare ancient genomes and contemporary genomes of different populations of people, we can understand what our potential disease susceptibility is today. So I'll wrap it up with this by saying, how far in the future should we be looking? Contrasting culture and science is not helpful. Removing the root of colonial science is. How far in the past should we be looking? Might those things have insight into understanding our health today? And at what scale do you want to make change? Finally, I'll leave you with this and just say, we've been futurists, and indigenous futurism is one of my favorite themes that's featured throughout this exhibit. I don't have to tell this audience, but you know we've been producing some of the first color newspapers in the world, and we had electricity in Iolani Palace before the White House, and so on and so on. We will always use the most cutting edge technologies to privilege Hawaiian and indigenous perspectives and empower our culture. So thank you, and I will leave it alone. Was it too long? No.
I think that was great. Thank you so much, Keolu. I've just been staring at chat a little bit to see questions as they come in. There is one from Riley Parks about how did Sullivan procure people for photographs? Were they willing? What did they think the purpose of Sullivan's project was? And Leah gave some answer that we don't have much documentation on this, and that's true. I unfortunately can't elaborate very much on that. I can really only speculate. Some things I can tell you are that in the 1920s, it was a rarity to be photographed. And so it's possible that that alone made it worthwhile. I can tell you that our records don't have any sort of indication of a consent form or of a script or of anything that he was communicating to participants. I can also say that broadly, eugenics did not have the same connotations as it does today. The full extreme kind of horror of eugenics became much more visible and clearer after the 1920s through World War II. So it's possible that even hearing the word eugenics would not have evoked necessarily the same emotions, even if you were told that you were partaking in that kind of a study. This is all speculation on my part because it is a really good question. It is something I have thought about a lot and something that I have been asked so many times and wish I could provide a better answer to, and I really, that's as well as I can do with that one. I think if there are any other questions, we can take them through chat if people want to do chat. Kelly, is it possible to unmute microphones if people want to ask questions that way?
I can answer one about the portable, the question about the genome sequencer and the cell phone. Very much so. Yes, that is exactly what is happening. So yes. Yeah. Is it
What was
attached?
attached to a smartphone? Sorry, I just wanted to repeat the question.
Oh yeah. That was a terrible answer on my part. Okay, it is. It is, yes, the nanopore genome sequencer, which is featured in our exhibit. The new model connects directly to a smartphone. That is correct. Which is almost like Star Trek, like the kind of tricorder thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the power of that is just fascinating.
Yes, and it will become cheaper and more ubiquitous. We are integrating sensors in so many different places all over the world. It's both hopeful and terrifying.
I had a question for you, Keolu.
Yes.
About that point you kind of made about like falling into old traps and kind of in reference to things like 23andMe. Do you think like sites, whether like sort of consumer oriented sites, you can like sequence your genes that really have like a heavy focus on sort of what your heritage is with regard to like these different races? Do you think that's in some ways falling into sort of these old traps by kind of like recreating a focus on race in a way that sometimes like pretty arbitrary, to be like if you're like 7% Finnish or like Irish or sort of what,
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like the resolution at which somebody like 23andMe is providing you insight into your genome is quite limited. So there's all kinds of different ways that bias is built into the algorithms that are used to interpret that data. And at what level and scale are you understanding the full spectrum of human genetic variation, right? So if you're only surveying a certain percentage of the genome, like if the genome is 6 billion units and you're only looking at 6 million units, then you're not really providing a tremendous amount of insight into that. And you're only looking at like individual typos. You're not looking at another form of variation called structural variation. And I don't want to get into the like, black belt level. But the idea that people internalize that as their identity is dangerous, right? Because your culture informs who you are just as much. But we privilege this empirical perspective. And it's dangerous. For example, 23andMe was trying to tell people what soccer team to support during the World Cup. that's just crazy. Like, anyway, but and Jillian, I think, really hit it on the nose when she was talking about the social context and construction of race. And if you wanted to say more about that, Jillian, because you really were elegant.
Well, one thing I was thinking about while you're answering this question as well is that, you get these results back of this percentage of what ancestry you have. And as Keolu is mentioning, like these can, first of all, be very scientifically inaccurate because they rely on very small and incomplete databases. The other thing is the very idea of your results rest on a sort of atemporality and the idea that nationality and culture and heritage has remained fixed on these landscapes, that these ancestries have never changed. So, Germany didn't exist as a country a few hundred years ago. So how far back are these results tracing your ancestry? What point in time is this? And what does that really mean? So I think that is a really important part of it. And then going beyond that, the idea that there's a really important transformation that happens in anthropology around the time of Sullivan. And in fact, in some ways, because of this, Sullivan is even quite behind the times, even in the 1920s. And that is, anthropology is already starting to move from being the study of race to the study of culture, and starting to recognize that language, culture, physical characteristics, all of these are independent of each other. Your genetics does not dictate the language you speak. Your genetics does not dictate your cultural traditions, knowledge, practices. Your genetics does not dictate who your family and community relationships are. And that's something that we tried really hard to drive home in this exhibit as well.
Could I add one more thing too? There's also this tremendous positive interpretation of that too. So we have these false distinctions that exist between, for example, something like Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, when in fact we know that we're connected by the ocean. We're not divided by the ocean in that way, but the biogeographical, they limit our connectivity, and that in some ways results in all of these different forms of racism that exist between other populations. When in fact we look at the genetic level and we see gene mutations that only exist in Polynesia. Well, no, they don't only exist in Polynesia, because we see them in Chamorro populations too, for example. So I'm trying to pick out these examples that can be used to deconstruct the idea of race using genetic information also. Okay, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Leah has pointed out, and I do just want to call this out outside of chat as well, the entire Sullivan collection of photography is available on OHA's Papakilo database, and that's papakilodatabase.com. That's a searchable database. So if you think you might have family members who are in the database, if you're interested in looking, it is searchable by family name. So that is a way. Right now the library and archives, I believe, are closed to visitors because of COVID. And so that is a way for quick access, at least if you're curious about searching the photographs.
I have a question for Jillian. You mentioned very early on that Sullivan's project was part of a much bigger project that happened across the Pacific. Did Sullivan go elsewhere in the Pacific, and where else was this research happening?
So independent of the expedition that I mentioned, which is the Dominic expedition, Sullivan did work in other places in the Pacific. I really should have fact-checked this to make sure. I believe he worked in Samoa, and some of his work is published in Samoa. He also worked with some indigenous tribes in North America, and kind of went to multiple places. It was the kind of work that felt like it was international and could detach from a particular place. You know, it didn't have a responsibility to a specific place. So Sullivan and many of his contemporaries would have looked in a lot of different places to build this kind of global or overarching idea of race and racial categorization. So I'm pretty sure that he has published some of this work from Samoa, and he may have worked in other islands in the Pacific and other places internationally. And I do, just building on this collection, want to say that these collections are very ubiquitous. They are everywhere. This is just one of so many collections that were created during this time. And that, the Marquesas and Samoa and Tonga, he worked in the Pacific. So yeah, so many of these collections from so many researchers, and this is just one tiny little piece of it. And I think that right now in this moment, we are starting to become more aware of their existence and become more aware of that we need to think about how these collections are curated, whether they should be curated, how, what they should look like going forward. Some of them are even more upsetting collections than the ones that we have, and involve kind of even more dehumanizing photographs and materials.
Thank you so much. I'm actually based in New Zealand, so work with a lot of other Pacifica communities. So it's really interesting to see. And early 20th century eugenics was, if possible, more popular in New Zealand than in the US, and has a massive lasting legacy here.
I had no idea of that, actually. Thank you for sharing that.
I would like to congratulate the Bishop Museum and Keolu and Jillian and everyone who worked on this. I think it's horrifying, but it is also the truth of actually what happened. And it makes me want to cry, but I am also delighted that this has come to light. And so I congratulate you folks all for bringing it to us, and am glad that it's going to be available. I'm going to tell all of my friends who are Hawaiians, they got to get to the museum and see this thing, including my Molokaʻi friends. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo nui, Ante. Really, it means a lot coming from you. And I think that we worked really hard on it, and there was like 110 ways we could have messed it up, you know? So I'm just glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, maika iloa. Maika iloa.
Yeah, I just want to echo Keolu's sentiment there. You know, we've been, it's been a challenge to figure out how to balance these very different ideas, and to have, you know, the long gallery is not a big space. And so we have these two very different stories in one place together, and it has been really hard. And we've thought a lot about whether or not we've achieved that appropriate balance of being able to talk about this really painful story, you know, in the spirit of educating and in moving forward, and still honor the people that are photographed in the collection and the families that we worked with. So it really does mean a lot to hear that. Thank you so much. And I'm very glad to see that this has been resonating with people.
Is this presentation going to be available for viewing after?
Yes, it is. We're recording all of the presentations in this series, and they will be made available online.
Okay, mahalo.